Hello, and welcome to the first episode of the Feminists Against Antisemitism Podcast. A few weeks ago, I was lucky enough to sit down with Professor Rosa Freedman, human rights lawyer, academic, and outspoken feminist, about her journey from the TERF Wars to the so-called Zio Wars. In our chat, Rosa reflects on how standing up for women's sex-based rights exposed her to bullying and harassment, but nothing prepared her for the surge of antisemitism and anti-Zionism after October 7th. We explore why anti-Semitism is tolerated in feminist spaces when other forms of bigotry are not, how anti-Zionism became a badge of belonging on the progressive left, and why denying Jews the right to self-determination is fundamentally anti-Semitic. This conversation dives into uncomfortable truths, the alliances between far-left activists and radical Islamists, the silence of the majority, and the urgent need for women to challenge hate in our own movements. If you like this video, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and Substack, and don't forget to follow us on X at FA Antisemitism. So I'd like to welcome Freedman for our first podcast. Professor Freedman, many of us know from the years of the TERF Wars, and now she is here talking with us about the Zio Wars and how it's been to be both a feminist and a Zionist. Thank you very much for meeting with us, Rosa.
Thank you for having me on.
The reason why I reached out to you originally was because of your recent article with The Telegraph, I Survived the TERF Wars. I believe it's something along the lines of, but I had no idea what was coming with the Zio Wars. I wonder if you can share with us a bit about that experience.
So a little bit of background, I suppose. I've had a career working in human rights, mostly in academia, but the kind of practitioner end of academia. So always writing for newspapers, always doing work with the United Nations, with governments, trying to be at the coalface of how do you take the ideals of human rights and translate them into the practice of making sure those rights are implemented. And in 2018, I saw a group of feminist academics bully and harass Professor Kathleen Stock for saying what I thought was fairly innocuous, that women-only spaces should be women-only spaces within academia. I looked into it a little bit more, and there was this consultation that had come out. So I was quite late to this campaigning. This consultation had come out about, can people self-identify? And I took my human rights law hat, and I've worked a lot on the rights of minority groups, including LGBT rights around the world at that time. So I looked at it and I thought, this is actually just erasing women's rights. It's not resolving a conflict of rights. So I put my human rights hat on and I sent out a series of tweets about women's rights, trans rights, how do you resolve a conflict of rights? I got onto an aeroplane. I went to New York where I was working with the United Nations. And by the time I got off the plane, this is before the days of Wi-Fi on planes, I found a barrage of abuse. I had some emails from colleagues or people I work with. I wouldn't necessarily call them colleagues anymore. And I suddenly found myself in the center of a storm about something that I thought was fairly obvious. Women have rights. Trans people have rights. Let's work out how we resolve any conflicts. I wrote that article about the TERF Wars not preparing me for the Zio Wars, and I reclaim the slur TERF and I reclaim the term, the slur Zio, because I'm not a trans exclusionary radical feminist. I'm just simply a feminist, an old-fashioned type, right? And I'm not a Zio. I'm just a person who believes that Jews, like all other peoples in the world, have the right of self-determination in their own homeland. But I wrote that piece for The Telegraph because what happened during the TERF Wars might have been difficult to navigate, but what's happened since 7th of October has been near impossible to navigate. And I often look back now. At the time, I thought to myself, why am I involved in this TERF Wars? I believe in women's rights. I'm going to put myself out there. Certainly my friends and family were asking me, we know you're right, but why are you doing this? Why are you subjecting yourself to vilification, harassment, bullying, all sorts? But it didn't even prepare me for the Zio Wars, because no one said to me during the TERF Wars that I didn't have the right to exist, that I should be dead, that I should be erased, that my actual being threatened the world. Whereas what we've seen since 7th of October, and particularly within universities and those settings, is calls for no Zios on campus, de-Zionizing universities, boycotts, not just boycotts of institutions, but boycotts of people, threats to life, and actions that have gone towards that. And as we saw this weekend, actions that have actually taken lives in Bondi Beach, but also that did in Manchester and Heaton Park and at various other places throughout the last 2.5 years. Nothing could have prepared me for that.
It's interesting. I was trying to think about the two experiences, and I agree with you. The experience post October 7th and stepping into the sort of the Zio Wars as a non-Jewish person has been an eye-opening experience, to say the least. There was something in being a gender critical feminist and being under threat in that way, that the community was really strong, that with this developed community of resistance of women fighting back for ourselves and for each other, and that sisterhood really existed. What surprised me post October 7th is it feels like the community, that's what's led, the community that was once a safe place is now a community that has turned against you, that has disowned you, and that, for myself, it's a silencing and a disowning. For yourself, it's something quite different. Like you say, it's the you shouldn't exist. And I wonder if that's what the difference is, that community of feminism has been so fractured.
I think there were various points during my time in the TERF Wars where I knew that there was anti-Semitism. Sometimes it was just straight up anti-Semitism, and sometimes it was anti-Semitism cloaked as anti-Zionism. Now, I always say to people, and particularly since 7th of October, excuse me, I have a terrible cold. I will be coughing. I apologize. I say to people, anti-Semitism is treating Jews as different to other people. That could be fetishizing them, saying they're all cultured, they're all rich, they're all musical. Or it could be demonizing them, right? They're all thieves and they're all cockroaches. If you treat a Jew as different to other people, that's anti-Semitic. If you treat Israel as different to other countries, right? If you hold it to different standards of account, or if you say that Jews don't have the right of self-determination, that's also anti-Semitic because it's the one Jewish homeland. And from early on, within the TERF Wars, I saw anti-Semitism on both sides, from the trans rights activists and also from within gender critical circles. It was often at a low level, but I remember being at a Labour Women's Declaration event and asking a question about Israel and about something that had been said within that event, and really being shunned afterwards for that. And there were many other instances that were less public and less publicly available, but they were very clear to me that there was anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism cloaked as anti-Semitism. I never expected anything different. I was raised an Orthodox Jew. I live as an Orthodox Jew, and we experience anti-Semitism on low levels and on high levels. And living in the UK, we've, throughout my lifetime, been very fortunate that where there has been particularly far-right, neo-Nazi, National Front anti-Semitism, that many, many people, the majority, stand up against it. But the anti-Semitism that's come from the far-left fascists, and I call them fascists for a reason, or from the radical Islamists, has been less addressed. This country has a great and proud history of standing up against fascism, but has not really understood how to stand up, which is how we got to the point that we did with Jeremy Corbyn and the anti-Semitism in the Labour Party that eventually got exposed and rooted out. So I don't expect to walk into any space and not find anti-Semitism from some part of that triangulation of the far right, the far left, or radical Islamists. But it was when I saw anti-Semitism within the gender critical movement, it's not only that it existed, but being tolerated in a way that anti-Black racism, that ableism, that homophobia would not be tolerated, that I started to move away from it. For me, it was always about making sure that women and girls had sex-based rights, that we found a way to resolve the conflict of rights, but also that trans people have their rights. Human rights are human rights for all people. Once I saw the anti-Semitism and I saw that my job had been done and I'd gone as far as I could within that world, I'd moved away. So when it came to 7th of October, I was not surprised by the anti-Semitism within the feminist movement any more than I was not surprised by anti-Semitism within all sorts of other movements. Anti-Semitism is coded into the DNA of every country in the world. Jews live currently in 98 countries of 193. There are 16 million of us out of 8 billion people. There's not a country in the world where we haven't been persecuted, killed, discriminated against, expelled for being Jewish. Anti-Semitism is coded in. So not that I was surprised, but the surge of anti-Semitism from the far left, or even just the left, the embracing of radical Islamist anti-Semitism, and strangely, the denunciation of anti-Semitism by the far right, who traditionally have been biggest proponents of it, that surprised me. And that's what I meant by nothing could have prepared me for what had happened, the Zio Wars since 7th of October.
I agree. It's been quite something seeing the what was the far right come out in support of Israel and Jewish people, and now there's the woke far right and the nitwentes of the world, and there is still that anti-Semitic far right, but there is this divide, and I've seen that because there has been this crossover with gender critical feminism and sort of Toby Robinson and the right on that side of things. There's been this agreement on this one topic, which means that it feels like a dialogue's opened up somehow, but there's still a lot of it's a very odd situation to be in, that where it feels like it's sort of Stranger Things or the upside down world of at the moment.
Look, I think my perspective generally has changed since 7th of October 2023. And a big part of that is that within hours, well, actually for us, it was a Jewish festival on the 7th and the 8th. So we didn't really know what was going on. We heard whisperings, we heard from non-Jewish friends and neighbours what was going on. But by the time I turned the TV on after the religious festival ended on the night of the 8th of October, there were already protests against Israel and in support of Free Palestine. Now, no matter one's views on Free Palestine, Israel was still collecting her dead, was still working out who'd been kidnapped, was still fighting against terrorists. And that was a moment for me where I understood that coalitions had come together in support just of Jew hate. I'm keenly aware that there are members of the right. I'm not even going to call them far right and far left, because I'm just call them right and left. There are members of the right who at the moment are in support of Israel because they hate Muslims. Just like I'm very aware that if I go to the Shankill estate in Northern Ireland, I'll see Israeli flags because they're anti-Palestine, because the Catholics in the Falls Road are pro-Palestine because the Protestants are pro-Israel, right? There's a sectarianism going on. But I also have understood much more over the last 2 or so years, and I'm okay about putting my hands up and not necessarily saying I was right or wrong, but saying that there are nuanced approaches that I need to take and that I need to understand better. My expertise is international human rights law, the United Nations, and peacekeeping. I hadn't delved into this area. I was not an expert on anti-Semitism until 7th of October, and until I was put in the position of really understanding it. I once helped to write the report, the first UN report on anti-Semitism as a human rights abuse, but that's still anti-Semitism within human rights. But I've really understood that the rise of radical Islamicism across Europe is a major concern, not just for the far right, but for all sorts of people, and that it's a valid concern. There's obviously a difference between radical Islamists and Muslims, and a very clear difference, as we saw this weekend, the imams, the Global Imam Organization, the Australian representative coming out so strongly against what had happened, not only in Australia, but the rise of anti-Semitism. But we have a problem in Europe, which my colleagues tell me from Egypt and Turkey and UAE, where the Muslim Brotherhood is banned in those countries, but is not banned in Europe. And that feeds into 75% of imams in the UK coming from Iran, coming from Saudi Arabia, not homegrown. And they are bringing with them the Muslim Brotherhood's version of radical Islam that has been banned in the countries where they've come from, or with Iran is being encouraged. But they're trying to bring it to Europe. I'm not saying that people on the far right who support Israel care about Jews. I don't think they do. But I think there are people on the right who are supportive of Israel and Jews partly out of concern and understanding that what Israel is doing, surrounded in a very tough neighborhood by many people, not necessarily countries, but many militias and terrorist organizations who are genocidal against Jews, are actually looking to create a global caliphate. And so I think what always happens, I remember my grandfather, Zivron Levrocha, used to say that when the economy goes down, when things are bad, they turn on the Jews, right? And we also know that what starts with the Jews never ends with the Jews. This is a wake-up call, what's been going on. Not what's been going on in Israel and Gaza, but what's been going on to Jews since 7th of October is a wake-up call to the world, because what starts with the Jews doesn't end with the Jews. And it's very jarring to me, who's grown up in an Orthodox community, I've had the history of the Holocaust. You live and breathe it as a child. You read when Hitler stole Pink Rabbit, your grandparents' friends, your friends' grandparents are Holocaust survivors. Suddenly the Poles are out there supporting the Jews. Suddenly the Germans are out there supporting the Jews. And I've had to recalibrate, why is this going on? Where is the real threat coming from? And the real threat is now coming from the far left, and it's coming from radical Islamists. It doesn't mean that I am friends with the far right, but I'm understanding more now why some gender-critical women, I won't necessarily call them feminists, they don't call themselves feminists, but why some gender-critical women did align with people from Conservative Party or the Reform Party and so on, where it came to gender ideology. And it's been a difficult journey for me, because at my age, having to take a step back and think that nothing's really binary and that there are nuances, it is tough and it's not comfortable. And I wrote about it recently, I think, for The Spectator. It's not necessarily where I would have wanted to be, but it's where I have to be now since 7th of October.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it was such an eye-opening event to understand that these rumblings of things that were going under the surface just came to light of suddenly, there is no left and right anymore almost, and that there are these alliances happening, some that are quite terrifying, some that are just quite surprising, and the question is, where did this all end up? But if I take a step back and go, well, how did we get here? One, if we look at feminism particularly, where did this idea that to be a good feminist, you have to be an anti-Zionist come from? Because I think that's where a lot of us are questioning our feminism now and where we sit within that community, because I don't agree that being a good feminist means being an anti-Zionist, and I don't understand why that's the case. You're the expert. I wonder if you can help us understand that.
I think we have to strip it back. So to be a good leftist after the Second World War and throughout decolonization was to understand that colonial rule, right, the power structures were a terrible thing. And colonial rule largely came from European countries. Now, what happened with the Palestinian Liberation Organization was that they aligned themselves first with the Soviets and then with the ANC and with Nelson Mandela in South Africa. And they built a narrative that what was going on in Israel and Palestine was the same as colonialism. They said, look at these white European colonizers. They weren't white European colonizers. The majority were actually refugees from Arab countries. And those that came from Europe largely had escaped pogroms or the Holocaust. Some did go out there for ideological reasons, but largely were escaping pogroms and then later the Holocaust. But they said, but they're European, so they're colonizers. They said, and look at what's going on there. They're treating us like you were treated. And when Nelson Mandela and the ANC were at that time a liberation organization, they were happy to be aligned. And one of the reasons was because Israel was one of the few countries that carried on having relations, trade, military and other things with the South African apartheid regime. So it became an easy narrative for the domestic population, right? Israel must be a colonizer. It's got this relationship with the apartheid regime and so on. So we're looking at the geopolitics. We're also looking at narratives. But it was the Palestinian Liberation Organization and other Palestinian national movements have been very clever about this, about making sure that they align themselves within the global south to the decolonization movement. So all these buzzwords that we now hear, decolonization, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, have been embedded from 30, 40, 50 years ago of making sure that Israel is seen as Western, as hegemonic, as part of the United States, even at a time when Israel was as aligned with socialism as it was with the US during the Cold War. And so placing Israel into that box. Now, if you're left and you're progressive and you're a feminist, you are anti-colonization and you are pro-LGBT rights and you're anti-ableism and all of these things. And we saw this in the TERF Wars, that suddenly there were some women who stood up for women's rights and they're being kicked out of the movement because they're not progressive enough. They're not aligning with one-size-fits-all leftist principles and values. The same is true within the feminist or left movements where it comes to Israel and Zionism. To get people to understand the complexities of why women might need their own sex-based spaces takes more than one slogan. It takes an entire conversation. And very often it's not just the TikTok generation, it's a protest movement and you know, slogans and placards, everything else. You can't fit a long essay onto that, right? So it's very easy to shout, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. From the sea to the river, Palestine will live forever. It's much longer to explain Jews have the right of self-determination. They've been persecuted in every country they've ever come from. This was the homeland. In 1948, after the partition plan was rejected by the Palestinians and the Arab countries, and Israel declared, that doesn't fit onto a placard, right? We found the same thing where it came to women have the right to their own sex-based spaces for all of these reasons, historical ones, social ones, trauma ones. It doesn't fit onto a placard. It doesn't sound as good as trans rights or human rights. So there's an element. There's also, I think, a large element within the feminist movement of being keenly aware that white feminists, right? Because I don't think that your race is your only determinant. I think class, I think disability, I think sexuality, I think all sorts of things. But the white feminists have privilege and power. And so we must listen and always be in support of minority, well, global or majority if we're talking about race, but minority in terms of talking about privilege. So I think there's all sorts of reasons why this has happened. But my biggest reason is the same reason I think, and I always say about universities. People don't want to be left out of the party. And if you have to say the right slogan in order to be allowed into the spaces, instead of thinking about the nuance and getting involved and discussing it, it's much easier to say trans women are women or Zionists are colonialists, because that way you're part of this community of good people that all have the right think and are all doing the same things together, and aren't we on the right side of history? I don't know that there is a right or wrong side of history. There are winners and losers in history. But it's much easier to allow other people to think for you than to think for yourself.
It really is. And that's, I think, why I was so shocked. And obviously I don't come from the same background, so I haven't seen and understood that anti-Semitism running through everything. And I thought, here we are, we're a group of people that have said no, that have been willing to be on the wrong side of history, that have read all the essays and done all the work. And the idea, same tactics that the TRAs used against women are now being deployed by the Free Palestine movement against Zionist, or even just, I kind of think it's okay for Israel to exist to women. And it bamboozled my mind that it can't be seen for what it is, that these are the same tactics being deployed.
It's not just that. It actually goes much further. The nail for me was when colleagues of mine set up the DINA project, and they were looking at, what do you do? How do you evidence rape and sexual violence when almost all the people are dead? Right?
Mm-hmm.
How do you evidence rape and sexual violence within a context where Jews bury very quickly? We try and bury within 24 hours out of religion. And what's the evidentiary basis? So they were looking at it from a law point of view. How do you take first responders' testimonies? How do you take hearsay? So lots of young men and some women who heard the rape and the sexual violence. And I'm watching these incredible women, right, and phenomenal people doing this work. And at the same time, I'm hearing people say they made it up.
Yeah.
They're feminists. What happened to believe all women? What happened to solidarity? Some of the evidence that I know, have seen, the sexual violence, there's a difference between rape and sexual violence as a weapon of war and rape and sexual violence of which we know men perpetrate in war, right? The power imbalance. There were the systematic ways in which people were tied up and tortured before they, and I'm not going to go into anything graphic, no, nothing like that. But then seeing people online, it's like I saw on Sunday, and the evidence comes out, video footage of men shooting at Jewish people on Bondi Beach, and almost immediately people coming out saying they're ex-IDF soldiers, they're plants, they're shields for the state, they're actually from India. I'm not sure why India, I guess because India supports Israel in the sectarian way that Northern Ireland and the Protestants do. Where is just humanity? Where is just basic humanity and solidarity? And within the feminist movement, come on, where is the solidarity with particularly these women, but also men who have sexual violence perpetrated against them, have mutilation, sexual mutilation, and so on. I knew from growing up that I was very fortunate. I've grown up in a time where the worst things that have happened to me in terms of me being Jewish is my son having some verbal abuse against him locally for being Jewish. That, being aware that there's low-level anti-Semitism and things like that. But seeing people almost cheering on, and particularly those who were saying, well, this is all legitimate acts of resistance. Come on, we're feminists. Rape is never a legitimate act of anything, including resistance. It cemented to me why I had joined in what I believed was a really important campaign about women's only spaces, but also why I had left feminist campaigning. It cemented it to me. I've been very interested by the coalition of women from across different political backgrounds and within the gender critical movement and beyond who have stood up against this. But it does remind me of how few women stood up against the gender ideology until it suddenly became the right buzzword to get into the party. I don't think that it will ever be the right buzzword to get into the party because women make up more than 50% of the population. Jews make up 0.2%. It's much easier to support women eventually, than it is to support Jews. I don't expect it, but it's still been deeply disappointing, and particularly for me, and I'm allowed to say this because I'm Jewish, it's been particularly disappointing for me to see Jewish women being at the fore of some of these, being tokenized, being quite happy to be at the fore. They're not anti-Zionists, they're just anti-Semitic. I think at this point in history, we can very clearly say that being anti-Zionist in this way is actually anti-Semitic. You're denying Jews the right of self-determination that we all believe that all people should have. And you're also denying Jews the right to defend themselves in the way that all other people can. And I'm more disappointed by the Jews in the same way that I would be more disappointed by my siblings or my family. When I see them at the fore of it, I think, how did we ever have anything in common when we're fighting against the gender ideology?
Yeah, that's something, again, I knew it was a thing, but experiencing it and witnessing it, seeing it, and just the shock at having to, like you say, have women deny rape and seeing that some Jewish women have been part of that. Again, it's the upside down world. And I was chatting to my father earlier today, and we went to the Lee Miller exhibition at the Tate. My father grew up covering world wars, for the news, and Lee Miller's photography was photography I grew up with and loved. And what I found really interesting was there was a line that came with her photographs of Dachau, the concentration camps, to the UK, saying, I implore you to believe that this is true. I beg you to believe this is true. And then towards the end, there was very much
this idea of the futility of it all and the futility of her reporting. What did she actually achieve? And I know that there's, I think it's Don Cullen, another war photographer. He's 90. He's been reflecting on his history, going, well, what did I change? Did my work change anything? And looking at where we are today and feeling incredibly demoralized by it all.
I mean, I have this generally with my work, and I was talking about this with a colleague just before I was speaking with you. We've been working quite hard around the slaughter of the Druze in Sueda in the summer, and the kidnapping and selling of sex slaves of Druze women and girls, in much the same way that Yazidi women and girls were sold. We're looking at ISIS 2.0 within Syria. Many of the countries that want to recognise al-Jilani as a legitimate government is because they want to return Syria refugees, not because they think that he's changed or that his military is anything other than ISIS 2.0. There's also been slaughter of Alawites and Christians and Kurds, but we're working particularly with the Druze community. And I was to this colleague of mine, it feels futile. You're picking up a grain of sand on the beach. Each grain of sand you're picking up, you're not clearing the beach. And she reminded me of that old expression about, but for each starfish you throw back, you're helping. And that's how I feel generally. And I think that there is a reason that so many of the leading, I don't count myself as one of these, by the way, but leading international lawyers and human rights people have come from the Jewish tradition or faith or ethnicity, however you want to view it, because Judaism is not just a race or an ethnicity or a religion. It's a kind of, and it's coded into our DNA about the rights of people, right? In much the same way that it's coded into my DNA to spot anti-Semitism, not because I've had anything terrible perpetrated against me, but just like a rabbit might not have been killed by a predator. So many generations were that they developed the big ears and the eyes on the side and everything else. So I think that it's not surprising to me that there is anti-Semitism in the world that I live in. I'm very fortunate that in my parents' generation and my generation, we, and most of our people around the world, have not experienced the kind of pogroms, Farhoods, Holocaust, everything else that were perpetrated for a long time. It's not surprising to me that women experience discrimination, misogyny, rapes, and killings for being women. Right. And again, that's coded into my DNA as well. I think what's surprising to me is how many people are willing to look away at both of those. In some ways, I prefer the ones who are out there shouting that, women don't have rights and trans women are women and all of these things, because at least they've got some kind of principle that they're adhering to. I completely think they're wrong. I know they're wrong. The ones that come out and shout no Zios on campus and try and push their way into lectures and kick Israelis or Jews out the room, they're 100% wrong, but they're standing up for their principles. It's the silent majority, and that's what used to get to me during the TERF Wars, was the amount of people that would say to me, I know you're right, I just don't want to say it. You're so brave for saying it publicly. And now I have the same thing. People sort of say to me, you're so brave for saying this publicly. I'm not brave. I'm not foolhardy. I just know that if I don't use my platform to say it, then why would I expect someone else to? And at the same time, having used my platform to say it, I do expect others to. I think it's devastating that so many people know what's right, but are scared by such a small number of bullies. It's the world that we live in.
It is. Although, as you were saying that, I was thinking I was blessed to be at a TERF Christmas lunch on Sunday. And I was speaking to a woman who felt unable to speak up during that time because her career was very, very dependent on not being cancelled and, bills to pay and a partner with going through cancer. And she felt very guilty and it bothered her that she did not speak up. And now on anti-Semitism, she is speaking up. So I wonder, there is a lot of worrying about the futility of it all and where are we actually getting to, and especially, like I say, seeing the scenes from Bondi Beach and everything post-October 7th. but maybe there is a little light in the darkness that enough of us, and not just Jewish people, but non-Jewish people, are being encouraged to speak up about what is wrong.
I think that was a key thing, actually, within the TERF Wars, was it wasn't just radical feminists who spoke up. It was people who are gender critical. And some of them don't call themselves feminists, and I respect that. It was men. It was gay men. It was straight men. It was people without necessary skin in the game. That's where things started to shift. I didn't speak up. When the radical feminists spoke up, I didn't even know this was going on. In 2013, 2014, I was busy working in Haiti. This wasn't on my radar. I didn't speak up. But the radical feminists kept speaking up until allies came to join them from all sorts of places. I think the difference here is Jews have been trained as 0.2% of the population not to speak up. Just like irregular migrants don't speak up, just like if you're LGBT in Uganda, you don't speak up. When you're a tiny minority and being persecuted, you can't speak up in the same way. It has been, I've seen a difference even since the Heaton Park murders in Yom Kippur and the Bondi massacre. The number of people that have got in touch with me has been huge difference. I think people are speaking up more and more. I also think that I understand why so many Jews are leaving countries, including this one, and moving to Israel, because people would rather be, there's 16 million Jews in the world, 7 million live in Israel, 7 million in America, and the rest spread over 96 other countries. People would rather be in a Jewish majority country, surrounded by neighbours that want to kill them, than living in a country where no matter how often we raise the flag and we say there is a major problem, there's a major problem. My kid goes to school with security guards and barbed wire fences. I go to synagogue with security guards. If I want to go to my local shop to buy kosher food, there's security cameras. There's all sorts of infrastructure. And the UK is far better than many countries in the world in terms of how little security we need. I understand why Jews want to leave. And I think unless or until the vast majority, not just majority, the vast majority of people stand up for Jews and our right to exist. I'm not Israeli. I can't vote for their government. I'm also British. No one ever blames me for Brexit because I had one vote. But I am blamed for the actions of a government that I can't even vote for. Until people turn that around and start protecting their Jews, there's a reason why there's going to be, and there is at the moment, a mass exodus of Jews leaving.
Yeah, I'm not surprised at all that they are. I've seen a good friend of mine. She is not Jewish. She's married to an Israeli man. They have 3 children, and they're looking at the secondary school for the eldest. And during the looking, she was invited to something to do with like identifying her culture and bring a flag of where. And even at that age, she said, "I don't want to," because she knew what would come if she did. And they're currently in Israel visiting family, and the sense of just ease at being who they are and themselves is so radically different from the two places.
About 2 weeks after 7th of October, I'd booked to take my child to Seville to watch Arsenal play away. And we went to Stansted Airport, and he wanted to put on the prayer filiatrix, to fill in that you put on in the morning after you're 13, after your bar mitzvah. And he didn't feel comfortable because he's a teenage kid to do it publicly, so he wanted to go to the prayer room. So we went into this prayer room, and there were 2 Muslims, a man and a woman, and they were praying on a prayer mat, and he put on his filiatrix, pressed head to toe in Arsenal. So 6 o'clock in the morning, we're all tired. He looks like a football thug. They look at him. He looks at them. I'm sitting in the corner, and we all smile at each other because we're all members of faith communities who are just there to pray. And afterwards, we came out of there, and he was absolutely fine. Nothing bothered him. That was 2 weeks after 7th of October. A few months later, as anti-Semitism had ramped up and up and up, he would not do the same thing on another trip. He wanted to pray at home. The young people in our community, I think, feel it more than anything. And They feel the stares. They see what's going on online, which I'm really pleased I don't understand TikTok or anything else. But everything is ramped up. You would think that after the ceasefire, things would have ramped down. They've got even worse online. They've got even worse in universities. And it's the young people that are leaving. It's the young people that say that they don't have a space here anymore. And that's devastating because not only did Jews fight for Jews to be here, we've got an entire country whose grandparents fought to make sure that Jews in this country weren't put into gas chambers. And I wonder how they would feel knowing that it's not their grandchildren that are making Jews feel that way, but they're not stopping it either. And there was this entire generation that stood up against the Nazis. And then 2 generations later, we've got a silent majority.
So we've spoken a lot about the problem and some of the despair and the futility and the awfulness of the last few years of what we've been experiencing and some of that history within feminism and why. I guess I want to finish on how do we fight back? There's an interesting dialogue at the moment between calling out anti-Zionism itself as actually a racist and hateful ideology and not saying, so for example, with the Bondi attack, that was a moment of anti-Zionist violence, not just anti-Semitic violence. And I know we don't have the picky slogans, but how do we, especially within feminism, fight back and show that anti-Zionism is actually racist and colonialist?
So I view everything through law. And within law, if Zionism is a political belief, then anti-Zionism is a political belief. Just like if trans ideology is a political belief, then gender critical ideology is a political belief. But what happens when anti-Zionism becomes unlawful, when it becomes calling for the deaths of people, calling for the destruction, at that point, we've stepped over a line. And for a long time, more so in Australia, even in the UK, we've been explaining that calling from the river to the sea and erasing, therefore, all Jews there is genocidal, is a genocidal, unlawful. Having a Hamas flag or Hezbollah flag at your parades is supporting a terrorist organisation. So the first thing we need to do is implement the law, right? Not implement the law where it's easy to do so, but implement the law where it's difficult to do so. That's how you protect minorities. That's how you, and I classify women as a minority. They might be percentage-wise larger, but in terms of power, they're a minority. So you need to stand up and implement the law. We got there with the TERF Wars. We got there with the 4 Women's Scotland judgment. I mean, the implementation of it needs to happen. But we need to implement the legal side to protect minorities. The second thing that we need to do is to raise awareness and understanding amongst people that targeting people on the basis of their religion is always wrong. So 7th of October happened on a Jewish festival. The Heaton Park massacres happened on the holiest day of the Jewish year. The Bondi massacres happened on a Jewish festival. It's not only that Jews are gathering to be Jews, right? Living while being Jews, they're practicing their faith and being killed during that time. If the same were to happen on Easter or Christmas or Eid or Diwali, people would recognize that immediately as a religiously based hate crime. So this idea that there is a war, a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, can never justify killing a Jew on the basis of them being a Jew, needs to be embedded, particularly within the progressive left understandings. What we saw at, for example, Philia, where people took a women's feminist conference and turned it into not anti-Zionism, but anti-Semitism. What we see on university campuses, where people turn it not from legitimate protests against Israel, but anti-Jews and anti-Israelis or anti-anyone that supports Israel's right to exist. This moves from legitimate political belief or criticism into unlawful actions. I think that the people expect too much sometimes from the police and the law. They don't understand that law often plays catch up to society, which is decriminalisation of abortion, divorce, homosexuality, and so on. And that only happens because of public pressure on the lawmakers to change. I don't believe, and it's not a positive note, I don't believe people will stand up en masse for Jews, because throughout the history of Jewish persecution, they never have. But what eventually happens is a tipping point where the hatred of Jews becomes persecution of others, and that's when people stand up. Now, it'd be lovely to say that I think people will stand up for Jews, in much the same way that in 2018 I thought it would be lovely if people stood up for women. But it was only when other groups realised what self-ID would mean to them that they started standing up. And I think it's only going to be when other people realise what this anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist movement means in terms of their own rights that they'll stand up. I'm 42 years old. I've never seen anti-Semitism under the carpet, behind a closed door, or anywhere else. I've always been very grateful to live in a country and a society where my rights as a Jew and my rights to my religious practice are largely upheld, even if we need a bit of security to make them happen. I think we're at a tipping point and beyond. And I don't expect the feminist movement to stand up for Jews. I don't expect them to stand up for women. And that includes Jews who are women. But I think it will take them a little while longer to see that the fascist far left and the radical Islamists don't care about women either. They're just using them and instrumentalizing them, much like in Iran at the time of the overthrow of the Shah. The radical Islamists got into bed with the left-wing progressives and said, let's overthrow the Shah, because he's in bed with the Americans. And the minute they overthrew the Shah, they killed them, they tortured them, or they expelled them. I don't know how long it will take until that happens. I hope we don't get that far. But I'm sorry not to end on a positive note. I just don't see anything positive currently.
Yeah, that is quite a depressing note to end on, but I think it is the truth and the reality of what we're up against. And that's why women need to come together and say no and actually challenge it in our spaces, and challenge it in our institutions. I'm heartened by the fact that when we put on our event in Brighton to try and counteract what we knew was going to almost certainly happen at Philia, it was so obvious to so many women that this was going to be a flashpoint with these two sort of groups as such. When we put on our event, when we started planning, we thought maybe we'll get 30 women. Maybe if we're lucky, we'll get 30 women. And then we had to fight to find a venue. Got cancelled by a venue when they found out what we were doing, had to find another one. Then we realised that we need security because it's a Jewish event, something I'd never experienced before. So we had to pay them. How are we going to pay them? We need a big event. And then before we knew it, we had a 250 people sold out event with waiting list and women begging us, how can we help? How can we do something? How can we fight this? So I'm going to take heart from that.
And I'll take heart from the fact that event, which again, I wasn't at, partly because it was the Sabbath and everything else. You had two of the biggest feminist Zio warriors, and there aren't many people that I can say they're a TERF and a Zio. Nicole Lambert and Julie Bendel. You couldn't get people who are more in the trenches on both of these things. And I look at women like them, particularly women like them, who they're not. I've got a job, I've got a salary, and I've got academic freedom. Women like them who put themselves at the coalface time and again in the TERF Wars and the Zio Wars, and they're phenomenal. And they are respected by so many people, and it was fantastic that they were platformed there. What we need is for it not to be a fringe event next time, but to be its own conference.
Yes. Well, these are early days of Feminists Against Antisemitism, but we have grand ideas and grand plans. So I hope this isn't the one and only time we chat. I'm sure we will be having many more, and we'll be maybe putting on our own conference one day.
I remember when Women's Place UK started, and they were selling 30 or 40 tickets, and by the time they got to even the event with Sharon Davies, they needed a bigger boat. I have absolute belief that women like you will make that stuff happen. And thank you very much for having me on. I really appreciate it.